Welcome back as we continue the 2023 Apologetics Students Conference, bringing truth and compassion to the transgenderism debate, sponsored by the Center for Apologetics and Worldviews and hosted at Bethany Lutheran College. The Center for Apologetics and Worldviews sponsors conferences, publications, and other opportunities to present evidence in favor of the truth of Christianity, to critique worldviews that oppose Christianity, to fortify believers with a proper understanding of Holy Scripture, and to engage unbelievers in conversation leading to the gospel proclamation of forgiveness in Christ. For those attending in person, a packet of handouts is available at the registration table in the back. Those who watch later online via video archive can find handouts in PDF form at blc.edu/apologetics. Our primary aim for this year's conference is to examine what the voices in our culture are saying about transgenderism and to respond to the confusion and the deception around us with clarity, with truth, and with compassion from Holy Scripture. Our next speaker specializes in showing Christian compassion to church workers who become fatigued from ministry overload and who need guidance in assisting those entrusted to their care. Dr. Beverly Yahnke is the Executive Director of Christian Care at Pathology, the Lutheran Center for Spiritual Care and Counsel. She has experience in teaching psychology at Concordia University, Wisconsin, as well as in private clinical practice. In recent years, she has devoted increased attention to the topic of today's presentation, caring for the transgender child. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Beverly Yahnke.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity on spring break to come to a warm and lovely place. Judging by the animal pelts in the audience, my opinion is not only my own. Okay, that's good. I am happy to be here because we are in the absolute epicenter of crucial need, and a need that Christians can respond to with confidence and with great help. I received a phone call from a pastor Palm Sunday weekend last year. It's a pastor I know reasonably well. He says, "I got a problem." I thought, "Oh, haven't we not ordered enough candles? What, is this an issue?" He said, "No, this is a real problem." He said, "We have confirmation this weekend." I said, "Wonderful." He said, "This is not wonderful." He said, "I have a parent phone call, and the parent phone call has just made me aware that a young boy whom I've catechized for the last 2 years in 7th and 8th grade, his name is Bob. Good. Bad," he said. His dad called and said that for his confirmation, he's going to be dressed as Roberta. He'll be dressed as a female, and he would like to be confirmed with the name Roberta, and we just wanted to square that away with you before we began. He has a problem. And it's not rare. And it's a problem that invites our undivided attention and our best efforts, no matter whether your vocation is that as parent, grandparent, student, professor, counselor, pastor. We all are going to encounter individuals who desperately need to hear the truth. The first presentation has outlined exquisitely for us what the truth is. This presentation is going to look more clearly at what are some facts that we need to be aware of if indeed we want to help explicitly those individuals dealing with transgenderism. You see before you 2 little baby humans, and you'll notice that they are appareled differently. I am guessing that at the time of birth, they did not convene a conference of professors, philosophers, and pastors to say, what color hat does each one get? Okay, it was kind of a gimme, right? So we're going to spend the next 60 minutes wrapping together politics, religion, and sex. What could be more entertaining, right? No human projectiles, please. All right. The goal is to be confident that we are well informed regarding the genuine realities, and when understanding the genuine realities, to invite compassionate, well-informed, and godly responses to people with transgenderism. I want for you to imagine at the very outset that every individual about whom we're going to be speaking right now has one descriptor in which we need to be intensely interested. And that descriptor is this person for whom Christ died. Right? And that's where we begin. We're going to explore what it means to be compassionate in some difficult circumstances. And we're going to start with some unassailable truths. We are baptized Christians after all. So let's go back to the 1529 Catechism, a real happening kind of document, where we find, I believe that God has made me and all creatures. I believe he's given me my body and soul and eyes and ears and all my limbs, my reason and all my senses, and still preserves them. And as Christians we say, done deal. It is a gift from God about which we're speaking. At the outset, I'll offer a caveat which says, I do not pretend to have all of the answers, but I've heard most of the questions multiple times, which is good. And I think a foundation of biblical wisdom is essential for us, some honest medical research and some data that we'll look at as well to inform our conversation and to give us confidence in responding to people who have some genuine needs. So my goal is to invite you to think with me about the topic. And that already represents an important step forward because some people don't choose to think about the issue. They emote, they respond, they react, they have reflexes about the issue. Let's check your reflexes. Big boys don't. Very good. If at first you don't succeed, be sure and wear. Maybe Minnesota hasn't learned this part yet. This is very concerning. We may have another deficit to attend to. All of those responses, save the last, are reflexes. And some people have adopted reflexes about transgender kids, parents of transgender kids, about all matters that may be controversial. They've adopted speaking points. We want to move beyond those together today. Why talk about it? Kids are confused, parents are confused, grandparents are confused, pastors and counselors are confused and overwhelmed. Teachers are begging for resources to use in their classrooms. Pastors are begging for resources to use with kids as they teach theology. And clinicians are afraid to help children for fear of losing their licenses. Our world has changed dramatically in the last 20 years, if you've paid any attention at all. In the last 10 years, the changes have been positively stunning. Some of you are old enough to remember the Norman Rockwell days, right? The Norman Rockwell bubble of wholesome worldviews is gone, blown up. So we're going to look at the culture briefly, because you know this Norman Rockwell bubble, the screen didn't advance. It advanced on the computer. There we go. Thank you. The American Christian worldview was a part of the Norman Rockwell bubble that burst long ago. And by the account of many theologians, we are now living no longer in a postmodern world, but we are living in a post-Christian world, and we have the siren call of a crazed culture growing increasingly persuasive about all kinds of matters, particularly matters of sexuality. And at the outset, I'll make clear that when Christians speak candidly either about the nature of their faith or the content of research, they're likely to be unwelcome voices in the public square. When Christians speak of their faith or speak about factual resources in response to this matter, the culture is going to continue to sharpen its capacity to punish truth tellers. Agree with the culture or be punished. Truth is, our culture has largely rejected the truth of God's word, the truth of God's will and his way regarding Christian sexuality, and Christian morality is regarded by most people in the culture as an absolute embarrassment. It is so last century, right? The chief sins in our culture today focus on very radical things like insufficient diversity or insufficient equity or homophobia or wearing animal fur Or the worst sin of all, advocating for the preborn, right? We've lost our way. We are now minority voices in a majority culture that's not particularly friendly. So why this topic? We may have thought that transgender children and issues would never touch our lives, but they are everywhere. And I believe as Christians, we have a responsibility to protect children and to bear witness to a distinctly biblical worldview. Dr. Michelle Cretella, I'll use her name a couple times in our conversation. She's the director of the American College of Pediatrics and one of the rare voices in medicine objecting to what happens to transgender children. She says America is currently engaged in large-scale child abuse. Complicit in the abuse is the field of pediatrics, psychiatry, our education system, mass media, and social media. Well, there's good news. I believe she's right. The overwhelming response to transgendered kids is often a community-shared delusion of sorts that allows children to be, get the word, irreparably hurt, if not damaged, for a lifetime. So, what's the size of the phenomenon? How many school-aged children are transgender? It depends on which resources you consult. There seems to be a reasonable agreement that an average of 0.3 to 0.5 kids, perhaps, among 13 to 17-year-olds, 0.73% of kids are identifying as transgender. And that may sound like a lot, but I'm going to ask this question. How many of you remember, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, the mothers of drunk driving being on every commercial at least once a night? You remember that? What are the number of kids who are at risk with drunk driving? 14% of school-aged children engage in binge drinking. Mothers against drunk driving aren't getting any PR. They're no longer fashionable. They're no longer on the cutting edge of the cultural agenda. The transgender children are. Or maybe we need to anchor the transgender phenomenon a little bit more clearly in terms of time. And when we do that, we want to talk with people who have been in the field for a very long time. One pediatrician who had been in the field for 50 years, which is a considerable amount of time serving children and their families, he surveyed 28 of his colleagues who were also pediatricians. Together, they had over 931 years of experience serving children. Among them, they could recall only 12 cases of transgender children more than 15 years ago. What's happened? So in 15 years, we have spiked from an almost nothing to an absolute cultural crisis. Let's look at the history. Our culture's most recent descent into this kind of moral rot has been chronicled in all kinds of places. First known subject of sex reassignment surgery, 1930, for those of you who want to celebrate the occasion. And it was not very well regarded at the time at all. It was regarded with suspicion. There were no first-person interviews, there were no magazine covers, and no television productions. The more current celebrity blitz was kicked off really when 2011 Chastity Bono became a man who was chest feeding his baby, if you can figure that one out. The next major cultural hiccup was the Bruce Jenner phenomenon in 2015, who stated publicly he believed he was a woman and won the ESPN Arthur Ashe Courage Award, right? The history is growing more and more common with people who are coming out as transgender kids. And in the background, even the more traditional kinds of publications, National Geographic came out with the cover, Gender, notice the word beneath it. What is it? Revolution. At a time this was still an infant kind of social response. Notice the use of the language, revolution. The phenomenon was in its infancy. Transgenderism was barely on the cultural radar, and yet the call to arms was signaled by what would be seen as a rather traditional publication. Okay, this is going on in the culture. Why do we need a Christian response? Yeah, there's some people who are engaged in activities that are damaging or dangerous, but why should this trouble us? The biblical concept of God's gift of sexuality is intended for the joy of marriage and joy of procreation. And yet most people who are dealing with the battle of transgenderism are not always practicing Christians. And their response to us is, hey, it's your God, it's your problem, right? It's my life, it's my choice. And once again, we see choice elevated as the single most important thing to which we need to attend. And so the unholy Trinity sings, me, 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 is all we're interested in. You'll notice as we look at some of the cultural agendas, there seems to be a real desire to tear apart things that ought to go together. For example, sex and marriage should go together. Gender and sex should go together. Conception and birth should go together. And they don't anymore as a habit. We're severing all things that were once useful, unified constructs, and we're creating them as the new truth. Culture has given us a competing structure, or if I may add to the first presentation, competing realities, which they regard as real and we regard as false, right? And we've entered a culture now where if you do not agree with the prevailing sentiment, you will be hurt, you will be quieted, you will be silenced. You may lose friends, you may lose acquaintances, professional responsibilities. And that's crazy, which means agree or be hurt. And it means our endeavor to protect transgender children to the best of our ability is going to be seen as malicious by some. It's going to be seen as bullying by others, or it may be seen as transphobic by yet another group, right? So we need to move beyond the madness of some myths, and one of the best ways to do that is for people to be informed, for people to marinate in the facts. And very often those facts don't always appear in the cultural conversation. At the outset, it's important to make the observation I'm going to be speaking exclusively about transgender children. I'm not going to be talking about transgender adults, although their needs are extremely real. I'm talking about the littlest ones. I'm also not going to be talking about intersex children, and by that I mean those individuals who at the time of birth have incomplete biological parts, if you will, or more specifically, incomplete genitalia. I'm not addressing that group of children either. Let's look at transgendered children. What does it mean to be a male? Didn't used to be so hard. Normal X chromosome, normal Y chromosome, boom, you have a boy, you have a male. What does it mean to be a female? Not that hard. 2 normal X chromosomes, boom, and you grow up to be a girl or a woman. I have never been more boggled than when watching some of the hearings for Judge Ketanji Jackson, nominee for Supreme Court hearings. She was asked, if you might recall, so can you tell us what a woman is? And there were about 5 seconds of silence, after which she responded, I don't know. I'm not a biologist. And you speak to the television screen and say, what? Seriously? It's gotten that far off the track. We have derailed when a Supreme Court nominee can't tell us what a woman is. Michelle Cretella, once again our president of American College of Pediatricians, says this: biological sex is imprinted on our DNA at the moment of conception, and it is in every single cell of our bodies. Human sexuality is binary. There are at least 6,500 genetic differences between men and women. Hormone treatment and surgical additions and subtractions cannot change 6,500 genetic differences. Okay, so we know what biological sex is. What's gender? Exactly what you'd think. The definition of the word has changed a little bit through time, but the American Psychological Association says gender includes attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that a given culture tends to associate with one's biological sex. So for girls, they love princess dresses, cooking, baking, crafts, and dolls. And boys love blowing things up, stomping in mud puddles, handling reptiles, fighting up, and dressing as superheroes. So what if I have a gender identity that doesn't match my biological sex? What if I'm a girl on the outside, but on the inside, I really want to play baseball and stomp in mud puddles and blow things up? That's okay. U.S. Army recruits lots of people who like to blow things up, and they're women, all right? It doesn't mean you need to change your perceived biological sex. We turn to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a 900-page book describing all the signs and symptoms of all the mental illnesses that exist. And in 1980, they used to call this confusion between gender and biological sex transsexualism. They grew weary of that, so that by 1994, they called it gender identity disorder. But they were afraid that the word disorder might suggest that we think the situation is disordered. And so in 2013, the word disorder was removed, and now we call it gender dysphoria. How do we define it? When a person experiences a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity, all right? And ultimately, that's what we're going with. And the diagnosis says, let's look clearly at how do we tell if a person has this gender issue. Well, there's an incompatibility with the gender he was born with and biological sex for a minimum of 6 months, and an intense desire to belong to the other sex, right? There are 5 additional criteria, but the 2 biggies are right in front of you, right? One of the things I think we need to mention as well when we look at these kinds of characteristics is how has it spread throughout our nation using these diagnostic criteria. In 2007, Boston's Children's Hospital was the only hospital in the United States that provided care for transgender children. One hospital in 2007. By 2017, there were 45 hospitals treating transgender children, which gives you a sense of the size and the enormity of the issue. The largest hospital in the U.S. is currently in Los Angeles, treating well over 700 to 800 youth on an ongoing basis. That's unheard of in our history. The youngest patient for whom they've ever provided treatment was 3 years old. Let that settle on your heart for a while. Some scientists are calling it a socially contagious phenomenon. I need to introduce you to a gentleman, Dr. Paul McHugh. He was a distinguished professor and chair of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And he says, I believe gender dysphoria is nothing more than a behavioral fad, spreading in a contagious manner, fanned by an uncritical and enthusiastic media, affecting parents' responses to the presentation of children's issues. That's concerning. So he's saying it has a lot to do with conformity, it has a lot to do with peer influence, and it has a lot to do with the desire that many teens feel on an ongoing basis to be accepted, to be approved of, to be liked, to fit in, to have a place. And for many of you who have just come through adolescence, you recognize that some of the toughest years to fit in, to be approved of, to be affirmed by everybody are the adolescent years. So we keep experimenting with who we are. We wear different colored socks. We have mohawk haircuts. Oh my heavens. But that grows back, right? Another recent study indicated that 87% of the children that came out as transgender, upon reflection by their parents, 87% of the children had spent an incredible amount more time online than they ever had before. So we're seeing the influence of media. And 87% of the children who came out as transgender had been spending a great deal more time in peer groups and cluster outbreaks with other kids who also had gender dysphoria. It's not COVID, but it's not bad. It spreads like wildfire. Dr. Lisa Littman of Brown University nearly had her professional career totally derailed when she published a study that confirmed, yes, what we see in the study is this. She says, we see kids who hadn't been affirmed, who were marginalized in other settings, who weren't fitting in, who were distressed, who were anxious, who were depressed, who turned to transgender identity to cope with those other issues. That was not a popular explanation of what was going on. And so she began talking particularly about girls experiencing rapid onset gender dysphoria. Usually with gender dysphoria, you see it beginning in children as early as 5 and 6, boys who want to wear frilly anklets or play with girls and girls' games. The rapid onset means a 14-year-old girl who had never had a moment of discomfort in her life is suddenly transgender. And the study that was done indicated almost 2/3 of the children had one or more diagnoses of a psychiatric or developmental disorder preceding the gender dysphoria. That's concerning as well. So Littman reports that when gender dysphoria is diagnosed among teens, we need to see gender dysphoria as a way that adolescents are using to respond to emotional pain. And an awful lot of people did not like that at all. Unfortunately, other data gathered said this, yes, this is a group at risk. This is a group that's very likely to be at risk of suiciding or at risk of self-harm of one sort or another. And yes, the data do support that. Whether or not children transition, 41% of people who identify as transgender will attempt suicide at some point in their life. 41%. Which is just an outrageously large number, all things considered, right? Ordinarily, we would expect that the percentage of people who attempt suicide is going to be less than 4% in the population overall, so the disparity is huge. The more frightening for parents is if I don't let my child transition, he or she may commit suicide, and the data is out there too. The percentage of people who attempted suicide and were hospitalized, this is just in the last month, the percentage who attempted suicide and were hospitalized was double for those children who transitioned versus those who did not, which totally upends all of the previous information. Okay? So, am I implying that gender dysphoria is pathological? Yes, I am. Right? Am I apologetic about that? No, I'm not. It's not a secret, and we need to share it. It is a pathology right? That is not an opinion that is shared by many of my peers in psychology. Many of my peers would, for example, love to have me silenced because what I'm saying is a complete contradiction to the way that they practice care for children and families. What I've come to believe completely is that gender dysphoria belongs in the category of dysfunctions that really has disordered assumptions about the body. Best example we can use in talking with other people is anorexia nervosa. Some of you may know an individual who is an anorexic or have learned of others who are, and who struggle with a delusion. Definition of delusion: a fixed, false belief. They struggle with the delusion that they're too fat. And so they do everything within their power to exercise, to constrain the amount of calories that they take in, high-calorie burning activities. We don't use liposuction on anorexic kids to remove that one morsel of fat that they missed. Instead, we watch their weight drop from 140 to 120 to 110 to 100 to 99, and then we force feed them because their perception about their body is wrong. And trying to correct that perception may kill them. They're delusional. We tell anorexics, your body image is not accurate. We don't let them make changes to their body that will harm them, either in the moment or long term. We work to change the mind. We don't surgically alter the body. There's the difference, right? You don't change the body when the mind is mistaken. It's simply wrong. One psychiatrist said, if I were to walk into my doctor's office today, it's a female psychiatrist, she said, if I walked in my doc's office today and said, "Hi, I am the Queen of England," he would put me on an antipsychotic medication. If, however, I walked into my doctor's office today and said, "Hi, for the last 40 years I've been a female, but I woke up this morning and I recognized I'm a male," he would help her to transition to that identity. All right? Congratulations, you're transgender. Here's the good news. The good news is that in small places and in some small important ways, there's pushback by the medical community. Tavistock, which is one of the largest transgender hospitals in the world, located in the UK, has stopped doing transgender surgery and transitioning care. They were forbidden to do any more of it. And they now have thousands upon thousands of lawsuits against the individual practitioners who physically altered and hormonally altered so many lives. We recognize some of the other large transgender clinics have closed in Sweden, in Finland, in France. The word is getting out, or so it seems, right? There was a video I came across completely by accident not so long ago, and I toyed with whether or not to show it. It's a little too long and it's entirely disturbing. It's a video of an individual who wanted no longer to be a human being. It's the video of an individual who decided that he wanted to be a dragon. And he had everything done to his body that would assist him in becoming what his mind's eye, his mental perception was. Let's take a peek at, once again, there we go. Where are his ears? Dragons don't have ears, so he had his ears sliced off. The changes on his face are permanent tattoos. He has scales tattooed across his entire body because he wants to look the way that he feels. And that's simply unhealthy, and it's simply not okay. And I personally believe and professionally believe that the people who allowed for this man to appear the way we see before him now should all be charged with medical malpractice. But that's just me. This man has been harmed and allowed for a delusion to be regarded as the truth. We can't shape the body to fit the mind, right? Okay. These days we're being asked to respect the judgment of children. Children know if they're born into the wrong body. Really? We need to respect the judgment of children. They know themselves better than anyone else. We need to respect the judgment of children. The boy who jumped off the garage, okay? The boy that bicycled down 2 flights of stairs because he thought it would be fun. The boy who filled his bedroom with water because he thought it would be fun to have a pool in the house. This is the kind of judgment that we want to honor. Kids who haven't a clue what sexuality is, kids who haven't given a moment of thought about what it might mean to be a parent and to have a family, engage in a relationship such as God intended for us. And yet, when a 12-year-old says, I don't want to be a boy anymore, and yes, I know that means surgical removal of my genitals, that's okay. Shoulder shrug, and we're going to respect that judgment. Yes is not always a good answer. Let's look at the treatment approaches so you are completely familiar with what that looks like. The first steps to treating a transgender child begin with the affirmations. We'll change his or her clothes, we'll change his or her name, we'll change his or her pronouns, if you like. New name, new clothes, new pronouns, new diagnosis, and a new bathroom. And once a child takes this first innocent step, there's a very good likelihood that the child hops onto this conveyor belt that takes him through all the additional steps with no opportunities to stop or reflect along the way. Let's look at the treatment. Stage 1, a child begins with puberty blockers. Block the child's hormones that would ordinarily lead to normal sexual maturation, the development of secondary sexual characteristics. So if you have a guy who's 12, 13 years old, and we put him on hormone blockers, it means he's not going to develop the changed voice, the broadened shoulders, develop the beard, the whiskers. But his peers are. His peers are going to continue in an uninterrupted developmental kind of scheme where they begin to look more and more like men, and he has been frozen in time in this boy-like state and concludes, see, I'm really not like them at all. I really am more like a girl. So hormones, which are intended to give them the gift of time, have already begun to help them dissociate themselves from a normal developmental male process. Get this, there are currently no laws that regulate the age at which hormone blockers can be used. They've been used dependent on state on some children as early as 10 years of age. No states prohibit the use of puberty blockers, of which I'm aware, although puberty blockers contribute to high blood pressure, to acne, to weight gain, and vulnerability to breast cancer. They are not FDA approved for the way they've been used. Parents are told in these early stages, this is reversible. Let's just honor his desire, humor him. There are no studies I've found that support that it is reversible. The rationale, gives kids more time, delays that appearance of those secondary sexual characteristics. It does not address the child's confusion. It does not acquaint the child with reality. It does not provide the child with psychotherapy to process. Why do I feel this way? What might the unintended consequences be? And are there other strategies I can use that would be more valuable, more helpful, and more healthy? Stage 2, cross-sex hormones. So now, instead of just blocking the normal development of a child's maturation, now we begin to administer, if it's a girl, we begin to administer testosterone. This typically can begin as early as age 15 and 16. and will almost always result in that girl becoming sterile for the rest of her life. The hormones that mimic the process of puberty that occur in the opposite sex will now take place in her body, and she will need to remain on those hormones for the rest of her life. Stage 3, upper surgery, bottom surgery. Notice this out of the Journal of the American Medical Association: it is impossible to recommend gender transitioning to minors as evidence-based or even safe. Right? In some ways, it reminds me of lobotomies in the 50s. Lobotomies were a way of helping when people were depressed, when they were anxious, when they were feeling completely out of sorts, when they were angry, when they had personality disorders. And all you do is you take a simple sterile probe, you run it up alongside the nose, through the eye socket, into the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and you do this. And you extract the stylus, and the people are no longer depressed, they're no longer anxious, they're no longer angry, they're nothing. And we allowed this to happen from 1950 until the mid-60s, simply because no one wanted to say much about it. For children born as boys, get this: as many as 98% of gender-confused boys and 88% of gender-confused girls eventually accept their biological sex. Wait is the take-homeable. There's no emergency. Wait! Okay. There is no proof that radical therapies will prevent adolescents from attempting suicide, and that is the number one reason that parents endorse their children's move in this direction. There's simply no evidence that that is true, right? What we've not attended to and what we need to attend to are matters of mental health, and by that I mean we need to refer children with depression and anxiety and personality disorders and confusion and demoralization for psychological evaluation and genuine care. We also need to refer these kids for spiritual care. This isn't happening to the transgender children who are receiving treatment right now. They say, I want to be a boy. They have 1 to 2 visits, and they're both gender affirming. In 20 states, it is illegal, and you will lose your license for helping a child to move against transgender identity. All right. So mental health is an issue that's been horribly ignored. So how do we respond to this in love? Be well informed, move beyond the myths, know the dangers, and then love, teach, care, pray, befriend. Don't be judgmental, because that drives children farther and farther away from us. Befriend, listen, care, love this person for whom Christ died, right? Those are the universities I know most about, and very little is being done actually to incorporate teaching about the realities of transgenderism and Christian sexuality in human growth and development courses, in human psychology courses. How do we weave this into the curriculum, across the curriculum, so that fewer children are harmed and hurt? Teachers, pastors, and principals are in a remarkable place of power and influence, and one of their first reflexes needs to be slow it down. Talk, think, pray, read, and there are in the outline a number of resources that are absolutely excellent for individuals who are struggling either as teens or as parents. I want for you to be particularly aware of a vulnerability, and that vulnerability is this. Some of the parents of transgender kids are bringing some freight with them into the process. 50% of moms with gender dysphoric boys have 2 or more mental health disorders. Let that sink in. 50% of moms with gender dysphoric boys had 2 or more mental health disorders. That's huge. An additional 25% of moms with gender dysphoric boys had 3 mental health disorders. So we cannot neglect care for the parent. We cannot neglect helping parents get the big picture, understand. Some parents, it would appear, are not able to talk with their children about the truths because parents have mental health issues that need to be attended to. Parents need to talk to kids. Parents need to examine the materials kids are reading. Parents need to look at kids' media use and examine the kinds of friends that their daughters and sons are making. It's vital that parents be involved. Schools, I'm delighted to hear that we're going to learn a bit more about curriculum. It's essential. Curricula, one Christian parent said, I was horrified to see my daughter's workbook. It was a self-published workbook of one sort or another, and it had, Jane's mommies are going to have another baby. Her mommies? How does that happen? So know what kind of curriculum is out there. Be vigilant, be watchful, be a voice of reason. Protecting your ministry, for those of you moving out into the ministry and want to know how schools are trying to preempt kinds of intrusions of legislation. American Alliance Defending Freedom and Protecting Your Ministry provides a wonderful downloadable booklet. So what are we left with? Gather, care, teach, feed, pray. Bring the gifts of God. Bless, love and respect parent and child. Repeat. And keep this in mind, I guess, above all else. We have a good and loving God who's promised us that he will equip us thoroughly for the doing of his will, that which is pleasing to him. We don't have to have all the answers. We have to be confident that when we walk into some of these difficult conversations, he will equip us thoroughly and provide precisely what's required, one conversation at a time. But we start with love, not judgment, patience, not a sense of hurry, and a desire to serve those whom otherwise might be hurt radically and irreparably. Thanks for letting me spend some time with you.
Thank you, Dr. Yahnke.
My pleasure.
We do have 10 to 15 minutes available now for Q&A, and so again, I'd like to invite first the college students to approach the microphone. As time permits, perhaps some of you from the community also can ask a question. And when you're ready, just approach and speak clearly. The sound text will adjust the volume for you. Please focus your questions so that we can also have time for others to ask a question after you. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying to find my question a little bit. So I'll try to keep it short because I have a hypothetical, I guess, situation that I'd like you to sort of give some advice on. So I've had a lot of experience with really little kids, and I hope someday that I can become a mother. I've noticed 2 things about kids over my life. That one, they don't really sometimes know how to make good decisions for themselves, and you spoke to that in your presentation. And then the other is that children are very naturally curious. Mm-hmm. My question is, a young boy becomes, I guess, fascinated by a pair of sparkly red shoes, I don't know, owned by his mom or his female cousin or whatnot. And it's not because of, fashion stereotypes but that they belong to a woman. It's just because they're sparkly and red and pretty and he wants to wear them. Do you cut that off at the hip? Or do you allow him to be fascinated by the shoes? Because I know that some situations say that if you cut it off at the hip, he'll become more naturally curious and then wonder why he's different than the other kids who are allowed to wear the sparkly red shoes. What do you do?
Every case is unique, which makes generalizations tough, so I need to begin with that. In some instances, we can point to the fact that most things are really innocent, particularly with little children. And distraction or redirection for little children is terrific. You like those. Look at these high tops. These are so cool.
Yeah, give him a pair of cowboy boots or something.
Exactly, another problem, okay. So for the littlest ones, redirection can be useful. It's also reasonable to say, those are really neat. Let's see if we can find some sneakers that have a red stripe on them. You like red a lot, and so suddenly now we're looking for things that are red instead of things that sparkle and are high-heeled. So one of the parents' opportunities is to point and to direct a child's interests and energies in ways that probably won't put them at risk. Some parents, admittedly, are just really busy and may not take that opportunity, but we also realize that we've got a lot going for us. Our Lord has designed in us a desire for little girls to imitate mommy starting around age 5, and for little boys who haven't grown a whisker and won't for another 10 years to start imitating daddy. And so daddies and mommies need to use their loving influence to guide, redirect, and shape. If it's happening at age 16, it's less curiosity and it's more a statement of, I gotta be me. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Certainly.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
All right, so I have kind of a quick question. I appreciate that you mentioned a little bit about getting our content from today's presentation and some other things into curriculums at schools and such.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, who should we look to combat those who are doing this to our children? We've learned today about how we should respond to with love and care to our neighbors, and I've been surrounded by little kids my whole life, more or less. But we are faced with, frankly, an agenda that's manifested itself in pornographic content in high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, extremely dangerous pre through K teachers, and legislation and media that are willing to back this up tooth and nail. What can I do as a college student? What can we all do? Where should we look?
I'll respond on 2 levels. One, for those individuals whose children are enrolled in a Christian day school, amen. And there are increasing numbers of what I would call public school refugees that are seeking the safety and the sanity of faith-based teaching, even if they don't agree with the faith. It's not these nutty people in the public school system. For those parents who have their children enrolled in a public school, it becomes increasingly important that one becomes, to the extent one is available, engaged and involved in attending things like parent-teacher meetings, school board meetings. School board elections just took place in my neighborhood. My neighborhood tends to be pretty progressive. Many of the people have all the antagonistic signs on their lawn. And there was nearly a fist fight at a meeting of the school board, which I found rather entertaining, but in all the wrong ways. Really. And so I think a number of parents are becoming vigilant. They're becoming appropriately vocal. They're not being kind of militant. They're simply saying, here are some things we've agreed are and are not acceptable. Why are my children bringing home this and that? So being vigilant, being willing to take risks and being advocates, asking questions that are difficult, and essentially saying no to some things and being willing to run for school board and get votes that can ensure wrong things won't happen. It's a tough battle. We are outvoted a good share of the time, and that's why we see more and more refugees coming to Christian day schools.
Amen. Thank you.
We do have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
There's another student, I'll let them go, so if somebody else has one. I'm Chaplain Don Molstead here at Bethany College. Thank you so much for your presentation. You brought up anorexia. I just wanted to, first of all, it's kind of a 2-point question, but the first is there less anorexia today that we see among young people than there was 25 years ago?
I don't know the statistical answer to that. I would say that it tends to be pretty much constant state, but any influence of media would have worsened it. I don't know to what degree.
Okay.
I would assume it's
I just, when I was a young pastor, I heard about it all the time. I dealt with cases all the time, and I haven't had any here in the chapel in the last 15 years, I bet.
So now you have gender dysphoric people.
I do.
Right?
I mean, once in a while.
Yeah.
I mean, not a lot, but it just seems like there's kind of fads to this stuff. That's I guess that's my underlying question.
Yeah.
I was in my alley working one day about probably 7-8 years ago when this was just starting to kind of get popular, and I heard a group of kids, junior high, across the alley from me. They didn't know I was listening, but there were about 6 of them talking on their bikes about what they wanted to be, bi or trans, and they were arguing with each other which one would be more cool. And it just made me realize that there's also, I think for some, not all, but for some, I think it's just a fad that is going to kind of wear out too. So if you want
for some, and I hope you're right, and I hope it is a fad, and I recognize that there are people who are very angry when we say that because they see a child who is horribly dysfunctional, horribly depressed, anxious, not fitting in, not affirmed. Finally, they found someone to affirm them. Now they're members of the LGBT group, and they found a home. It's a home that's unhealthy, but it's a home they feel they belong in. So ultimately, maybe one of our opportunities is we care for these kids, we validate them, we connect them with other kids who are healthy for them. We do what we can to love on them so they need not go in some dysfunctional ways. And to the extent we're able, we try to ensure that they get the care that's really useful, the psychotherapy that would benefit them a great deal more than hormone blockers.
We do have time for one more question, if anyone would like. Go ahead, sir.
I'd like to thank all the presenters for the great presentation so far.
Thank you.
And I'll get right to my question. This kind of also plays into the first presentation a bit. For young kids, I do know with their inquisitive and curious minds, they may have very many questions about different things. And I noticed specific examples. Well, why is this? Why?
Yeah.
And how do the parents use their roles to provide the so-called edges to reality,
right,
and bring truth to this issue?
Parents are invited to speak the truth in love. Sometimes parents are caught at a busy time or a time unawares and are so accustomed to thousands of questions from why is watermelon pink? All right, and very often the questions about sexuality might just fall into a rainfall of other questions, and it may not be seen as one that's very important to answer. Speaking the truth in love has to become the sieve through which parents see their children's questions. In what ways do the questions they ask prepare them to see a good and loving God as someone who has created an ordered creation, right? A divine and ordered creation, and has fearfully and wonderfully made us. So the parent's job is always teaching, and always, to the extent that it's possible, providing godly explanations for what happens. And even when we don't know the answer, I think it's reasonable to say, we'll have to ask that when we get to heaven. I don't know why God made mosquitoes. I'm really upset about it too, right? So using God's word as the ultimate authority, as he who created a perfect world that we destroyed, but we maintain order within what is now a fallen world. His order, to the extent that we're able.
Thank you.
And thank you again, Dr.